3 weeks before Russia launched its most anticipated offensive of 2026, Ukraine quietly destroyed the conditions that made it possible, not with a dramatic strike on Russian headquarters, not with a long-range missile into Moscow, with a whitelist, a verified registry of authorized satellite terminals sent by Ukraine's defense minister to a private American technology company in California. And when that company enforced it, the entire communications architecture that Russia's frontline forces had been secretly depending on collapsed simultaneously across more than 1,000 kilometers of front. That is where this story begins. But to understand why it matters, you need to understand what Ukraine did next in the silence that followed. Let's go back to the beginning. February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury opened the front in a way that changed the entire calculus of the war. But 700 kilometers south and west of that operation's epicenter, something else was happening, something that military analysts are now calling one of the most consequential sequences of events in the entire 3-year conflict. First, the unit, the 76th Guards Air Assault Division. This is the formation that entered Belarus in March 2022 with the mission of seizing Hostomel Airport in the opening hours of the full-scale invasion, the plan that was supposed to open the door to Kyiv in 72 hours. This is the unit that Ukraine's forensic teams later documented committing war crimes in residential neighborhoods outside the capital. It is not simply an elite formation in the bureaucratic sense. It is Russia's premier rapid reaction ground force, the unit the Kremlin deploys when something breaks and nothing else will fix it. By 2025, after 3 years of continuous attrition, the 76th had been ground down to the point where it was operating 70-year-old T-55 tanks salvaged from long-term storage. A Forbes analysis from April 2025 documented something almost surreal. Paratroopers from the 76th attacking Ukrainian positions near the Russian border in Kursk Oblast while riding electric scooters. That is not a metaphor. That is what degradation looks like at the end of 4 years of the most attritional land war since Korea, and yet Moscow still reached for this unit when it needed results. In November 2025, elements of the 76th, along with its constituent 104th, 234th, and 237th VDV regiments, were redeployed to the Pokrovsk direction, Russia's premier offensive axis in Donetsk. The fall of Pokrovsk and Myrnograd in January 2026 had been achieved at staggering cost but had failed to produce the operational breakthrough the Kremlin had been promising for months. The 76th was sent in to restart momentum on the most important offensive sector on the entire front. That chip was pulled off the table in late January 2026, not by a Russian decision, by Ukraine. Here is what Ukraine did and how precisely it executed it. In late January and early February 2026, Ukrainian forces launched what their official communications described as limited stabilization operations on the Huliapol and Orikhiv axes in Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. The language was deliberately modest. The reality was not. Ukrainian forces attacked on at least 9 vectors simultaneously. The 24th Separate Mechanized Brigade, equipped with American Bradley M2A2 infantry fighting vehicles and Swedish CV-90s, pushed along the Anuriivka River corridor into the Russian rear. Ukrainian air assault troops cleared Russian positions north of Huliapol. Special operations teams infiltrated along river lines. The result, Russia lost in 7 days everything it had taken in 60. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky confirmed on February 23 that Ukraine had liberated 400 square kilometers and 8 settlements since late January. By early April, that figure had grown to 480 square kilometers and 12 settlements. February 2026 became the first month since 2023 in which Ukraine regained more territory than it lost across the entire front, and then came the ISWAL report using data from March 6th and 7th, describing the knock-on effect in clinical but devastating language. The Russian military command had laterally redeployed elements of the 76th VDV division, the same formation, sent to Pokrovsk to restart the stalled Donetsk offensive, to the Orikhiv direction in Zaporizhzhia to plug the gap Ukraine had torn open. The 40th Naval Infantry Brigade from the Pacific Fleet, another formation deployed only in genuine emergencies, was pulled from the Dobrylia tactical area and sent to the Huliapol direction. Elements of the newly formed 55th Naval Infantry Division, also Pacific Fleet, were sent to the Palahi area south of Huliapol. The 68th Army Corps, including its 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade and 1,472nd Motorized Rifle Regiment, was pulled from near Pokrovsk and Dobrylia in Donetsk Oblast and redirected south. ISU's assessment stated the conclusion directly. Ukraine's counterattacks in February-May 2026 have disrupted Russia's plans to continue exploiting tactical successes in Zaporizhzhia Oblast and may have generated spoiling effects for the anticipated spring-summer 2026 offensive against Ukraine's fortress belt. That word may have is ISWAL being cautious. Here is what the evidence shows has actually happened to that spring offensive. On March 21, 2026, ISWAL confirmed that Russian forces had likely initiated their spring-summer 2026 offensive targeting Ukraine's fortress belt. The fortress belt is a 50-kilometer chain of fortified cities stretching from Sloviansk through Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Kostyantynivka. It is the backbone of Ukraine's defense in Donetsk Oblast. Its fall would open direct routes west toward Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Zaporizhzhia. Putin has made no secret of his intention to seize these cities and has demanded their surrender as a precondition for any ceasefire. The Russian assault developed along three axes: north through the Lyman direction, south through the Kostyantynivka approaches, and directly on the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk conurbation in the first. For days, Sersky reported more than 6,900 Russian soldiers killed or wounded over a single week. On March 19 alone, Ukrainian forces reported 405 Russian casualties out of approximately 500 assault personnel committed, a casualty rate above 80%. By late March 2026, Russia's spring offensive had stalled. ISU's March 29 assessment found that Russian forces remained unlikely to seize the fortress belt in 2026. The only Russian army positioned for a direct push on Sloviansk, the 3rd Combined Arms Army, had not gained ground in a week after a month of tactically significant advances. The flanking formations, the 20th and 25th Combined Arms Armies in the Lyman direction, the 8th Combined Arms Army and 3rd Army Corps near Kostyantynivka, were advancing more slowly. ISWL concluded that a direct assault on Sloviansk without supportive flanking operations would likely inflict critically high casualties for disproportionately minimal gains. A Russian State Duma lawmaker said publicly on March 23 that losses are inevitable in any war, but Russian troops will try to reduce them by advancing slowly. ISWL noted this messaging suggests the Kremlin is already preparing the Russian public for why the offensive will fail. Russia began shaping its domestic failure narrative before the offensive was 2 weeks old. Now, the third actor, the one that didn't fire a single shell. It is February 1, 2026. Elon Musk, CEO of SpaceX, posts on X, "Looks like the steps we took to stop the unauthorized use of Starlink by Russia have worked." Ukraine's defense minister Fedorov had spent weeks building a verified whitelist, a registry of every authorized Ukrainian military Starlink terminal, and had submitted it to SpaceX. On February 1 and the days that followed, SpaceX enforced it. Every smuggled Starlink terminal, every captured terminal, every terminal that Russian forces had been using to pilot long-range attack drones, coordinate artillery fire, and receive headquarters commands, all of it went dark simultaneously, across more than 1,000 kilometers of front, a senior NATO official told reporters in Brussels. On February 11 that the Starlink cutoff had put Russian forces in what he called a command and control predicament. Ukraine's defense ministry advisor Sahidak Basrysenkov, call sign Flash, was more direct. The Russian military doesn't have a problem. It has a catastrophe. According to Moscow City Duma Deputy Chairman Andrei Medvedev, the cutoff resulted in planned strikes against Ukraine being stopped and created a crisis on the front lines as Russian troops could no longer coordinate. Pro-Kremlin blogger Boris Rosen wrote on Telegram, "Yes, there are no alternatives at all. Right now, intercepted Russian communications showed field commanders screaming for information they no longer had, drone operators whose long-range systems suddenly could not navigate, artillery coordinators who could no longer pass grid coordinates. Infantry assault groups with no awareness of friendly unit positions on their left or right. In that specific window of maximum Russian confusion, a window Ukraine's general staff knew would last only weeks, the 24th Mechanized Brigade moved south along the Anuriivka River corridor, into the Russian flank and into history. The single most consequential technological decision of the 2026 campaign was not a missile system, not a new tank, not an AI targeting algorithm. It was a whitelist enforcement decision made by a private American citizen operating a satellite internet company from California, and the Russian military, which had become structurally dependent on stolen bandwidth from that company's satellite constellation, had built no redundancy, no alternative, no fallback. Russia's $250 billion annual military budget had created a force that was, at its most critical operational moment, blinded by a software update. Now the full picture of where this war actually stands. As of April 22, 2026, day 1,519 of Russia's full-scale invasion, total confirmed Russian combat losses have reached approximately 321,500 personnel since February 24, 2022. That figure, updated by Ukraine's General Staff this morning, includes 1,400 losses in the past 24 hours alone. CSIS's January 2026 estimate placed Russian casualties at 1 to 2 million killed and wounded, more losses than any major power in any war since World War II. At current rates, combined Russian and Ukrainian casualties could approach 2 million by late 2026. Russia has confirmed losses of 24,440 tanks and armored vehicles and 29 naval vessels. These are not the losses of a winning army. They are the losses of an army conducting what PBS analysis called the slowest major offensive campaign in any war in the last century, advancing at between 15 and 70 meters per day, slower than the Battle of the Somme, slower than World War I. Yuri Podolyaka, a prominent pro-Kremlin military blogger with nearly 3 million Telegram subscribers, expressed public doubt in late March over whether Russian forces can reverse the unfavorable battlefield situation in the south. That is not a Ukrainian analyst questioning Russian capability, that is a Kremlin-adjacent commentator, publicly stating that Ukraine may have broken something Russia cannot fix. Russia's fundamental problem in 2026 is not a shortage of soldiers or a shortage of shells. Those are real constraints, but the deeper crisis is structural. Russia cannot simultaneously maintain offensive pressure on the fortress belt, defend against Ukrainian counterattacks in the south, hold gains around Pokrovsk against spoiler operations, and sustain its drone and missile campaign against Ukrainian cities all at the same time, with the forces remaining after 4 years of attrition. Every time Russia concentrates forces for a breakthrough in one sector, Ukraine finds and exploits a gap in another. The 76th VDV went to Pokrovsk to restart the stalled Donetsk offensive, and Ukraine's February counteroffensive in Zaporizhzhia pulled its regiments south before they could generate momentum. The 68th Army Corps was positioned for action near Dobrylya and ended up fighting defensive battles near Huliapol, hundreds of kilometers from where Russia needed them. Pacific Fleet naval infantry formations Russia deploys only in genuine emergencies is now fighting steppe warfare near Palahi, a city that has nothing to do with naval operations and everything to do with the fact that Russia ran out of other options. Every redeployment diluted the offensive Moscow was building, and the fortress belt that Putin demanded his commanders take before summer remains intact, the diagnostic number that encapsulates Russia's strategic crisis. In the week of Russia's largest spring offensive push, March 19th through March 25th, Russian casualties were roughly double the levels seen over the previous winter months. At that casualty rate, Russia would exhaust its current pool of trained assault personnel within months. Western officials reported in February 2026 that Russia had, for the first time in the war, begun losing more soldiers than it could recruit for 000 casualties per month, outpacing replacement capacity. The solution Moscow reached for was to cut basic training for assault replacements from 1 month to 1 week. A Ukrainian Mechanized Brigade spokesperson documented the result on March 21st. Assault groups arriving at the line knowing only basic infantry movement, with no understanding of combined arms coordination. The Kremlin's propaganda apparatus, whose funding Putin increased by 54% in 2026 to sustain domestic support, is already working on the failure narrative. The Duma lawmakers' March 23rd statement about advancing slowly to reduce losses. The terminology shift from spring offensive to ongoing operations. The quiet redeployments that are never announced, only observed by open-source analysts and confirmed days later in ISWL reports. Russia is preparing its domestic audience for an offensive that will not achieve its stated goals, fought by an army that has been systematically degraded, using elite formations that are no longer elite in anything but name. Against all of this, against 7,767 drone combat engagements every day, against 206 ground contacts every 24 hours, against 15 large-scale strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure between December 2025 and February 2026 that left Kyiv's 3.5 million residents without power for half of each day in January, Ukraine is still advancing in the south, still firing ATACMS missiles at Shah drone launch sites in occupied Donetsk, destroying not just drones but the logistics infrastructure that produces them. Still striking Russian oil infrastructure at Luga, Primorsk, and Tupsi, having taken down approximately 20% of Russia's refining capacity since early 2024, still operating a 480 square kilometer recaptured zone in Zaporizhzhia that has placed Palahi, Russia's critical southern logistics hub, within range of Ukrainian artillery. Here is the connection that ties everything together. The spring offensive that ISWL says Russia likely cannot win in 2026 is the same offensive that Putin's Kremlin told the Russian public would determine the war's outcome. The fortress belt of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Drezhkivka, and Kostyant Anuriivka was the objective that defined the entire 2026 campaign plan. If Russia takes those cities, it controls most of Donetsk Oblast, opens routes toward Kharkiv and Dnipro, and can negotiate from a position of territorial dominance. If Russia does not take those cities, if the fortress belt holds, then all of the blood and treasure expended since January 2024 has produced what CSIS called minimal gains at extraordinary price. And Putin, who told his domestic audience that military momentum was inevitable, will be explaining to Russians why the 76th Guards Air Assault Division, the formation that was supposed to lead the decisive push, is instead fighting a defensive battle in the steppe near Huliapol in a sector that was never supposed to be contested at all. The 24th Mechanized Brigade didn't just recapture 480 square kilometers, it didn't just place Palahi within artillery range. It pulled Russia's best remaining assault formation off the board at the exact moment that formation was supposed to be generating the decisive breakthrough of the war. The fortress belt stands on April 22nd. Ukraine's defenders occupy the dominant heights east of Sloviansk. Russian assault groups continue to arrive with 1 Week of training, no functional Starlink connectivity, no operational flexibility, and orders from Moscow that have not changed even as the situation on the ground has changed completely. This is how a war turns, not in a single dramatic moment. In a cascade of consequences, a satellite whitelist enforced in California, a flanking maneuver along a frozen river corridor, an elite division pulled from its offensive axis, a fortress belt that holds, an oil refinery burning in Samara, a logistics hub within artillery range, a spring offensive already being rationalized. As a necessary sacrifice, Russia's army is not retreating to Moscow, it is retreating to positions it hoped it would never have to defend. The distance between those positions and Moscow is measured not in kilometers, but in the widening gap between what Putin promised and what his generals can deliver. The summer will answer the question this data is circling. Can Russia replace its losses fast enough, rebuild its southern defensive lines quickly enough, and sustain the fortress belt assault long enough to achieve what its own bloggers are already publicly doubting? Or will Ukraine use the window created by the South, the EU's $90 billion in newly unlocked military and financial support, and the diplomatic credibility earned through 3 years of refusing to break to achieve what no contingency plan in Moscow's general staff is designed to handle? Forward or frozen, breakthrough or stalemate, the fortress belt stands or it doesn't. Everything that comes next depends on what happens in those 50 kilometers of fortified cities between Sloviansk and Anuriivka.